Hey everybody. So I wanted to give you guys just a week one lecture quiz review. Just going over some of the things that we talked about in week one. I know we went over a lot of stuff, right? But just to recap a few, we'll keep it short and straight to the point, right? We want to remember that anatomy, right? It's going to be the structure of those internal and external structures, right? So we're looking at the physical structures, right? On the outside and the inside of the body, right? The study of the relationship between the body parts, right? So it's going to give us a careful observation of the human body, right? This is going to be human anatomy, right? And of course, it's going to provide clues about physiological functions. And we know that physiology is the study of the function, right? Whereas anatomy, again, is going to be the study of those, the structures, okay? When we're looking at an anatomical position, so we want to remember anatomical position is standing with your feet flat on the floor, right? Feet, slightly shoulder width apart in a sense. The hands are going to be at your side, but your palms are going to be facing forward, right, or anterior. Okay, so we want to remember that this individual right here, right, Mr. Bob, he's in anatomical position. Okay, we also want to understand and remember that supine, I think the soup, right? Supine is laying down, face up, palms up, right? In anatomical position. Okay, so remember that. Whereas prone is lying face down, right? Palms down. Okay. Remember those different anatomical directions, right? Superior, going up toward the head. Inferior, going down toward the feet. Anterior, the front, or ventral, the front. Posterior, the back, or dorsal, the back. Medial, going towards the midline. It's medial, towards the midline, toward the center. Lateral, going away from the midline, right? Going to the outside of the body, right? Superficial, right, is closest to the body's surface. Deep within the body. Proximal, right, going toward the attached base. Distal, going away from that attached base. Okay, proximal in proximity, in close proximity. Distal at a distance, right? Remember those different sectional planes, right? So remember a sagittal plane is going to separate into right and left portions. Specifically, a mid-sagittal plane is when we're cutting you right down the middle, right down the center, giving you equal halves, equal left and right portions, right? But a frontal or a coronal plane, right, that's going to separate the body, right, giving you an anterior and posterior portion, right? So we're cutting right down, right, giving you a front and a back, giving you an anterior and a posterior portion of the body, okay? And of course, we have a transverse plane, right? These transverse cuts, right? That's going to give you cutting you right there. Going to give you a superior portion and an inferior portion of the body. Okay, so remember these different planes, right? The mid-sagittal plane, transverse plane, and that coronal plane. Okay. And remember the body cavities, right? The body can be divided into two major cavities. We have that posterior or the dorsal cavity, right, being that cranial cavity and that spinal cavity, right? Also remember that the body is going to have that anterior cavity, right, the front, or that ventral cavity, which is going to be made up of the thoracic cavity, going to be separated at this diaphragm, and we're also going to have the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, and we can also separate the abdominal pelvic cavity into the abdominal and the pelvic cavity. Okay, so remember that. Well, remember the cell, right? Remember the cell. Remember the cell. It's going to be surrounded and protected by that cell membrane, right? That cell membrane is going to be on the outside surface of the cell, protecting it from the exterior, okay? Remember the organelles, right? I want you to remember all of the organelles, of course. Excuse me. But remember some of those key organelles, right? Those mitochondria, Right? The mitochondria is important, responsible for producing the energy, right, in the form of ATP within the cell. Okay. Remember those ribosomes, right? We have fixed and we have free ribosomes. But remember those ribosomes are there for protein synthesis, right? Those ribosomes are very, very important because these are where our proteins are synthesized. These are where our proteins are made, okay, on the ribosomes. Okay, so remember that. Very important. Remember talking about membranes, right? We know our membrane is selectively permeable, right? Well, so where it's going to allow certain things in and it's going to inhibit the passage of other things, right? But for molecules to move, we talk about passive processes and active processes, right? So I want you to remember diffusion, right? Diffusion is going to be the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, okay? Again, diffusion, all right, I advise you to write it out, all right? The movement of molecules. Right, so we're not talking about water, we're talking about molecules such as CO2, oxygen, right? Sugar, right? These molecules moving from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, typically down a concentration gradient, okay? This happens just naturally, passively, without energy. Osmosis, it is the diffusion, right? So we're still talking about diffusion, moving, down a concentration gradient from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. But osmosis specifically deals with the diffusion of water molecules, okay? So osmosis is the diffusion of water molecules across that selectively permeable membrane, where we're moving from an area of high water concentration to an area of low water concentration. But notice in this example, right, that water is going to move out of the cell, right? There's a high concentration of water inside the cell, and there's a low concentration of water outside the cell. But let's look at the solute concentration. There's a low concentration of solute inside the cell, but there's a high concentration of solute outside the cell, right? So in other words of saying osmosis is the diffusion of water, right, from an area of high water concentration to an area of low water concentration. We can also say that osmosis is the diffusion of water from an area of low, right, so low solute concentration to an area of high solute concentration. Okay, we go from low solute inside the cell to high concentration of solute outside the cell. Okay, so remember that about osmosis. And again, diffusion and osmosis, it's passive. We don't require energy. Now, active transport, like active processes, they require energy. They require the need of ATP, right? And these active transports, they will use proteins, right, to transport a substance or transport a molecule against a concentration gradient, right? So they can move it irregardless of that concentration gradient, right? Opposing that concentration gradient. Whereas diffusion, right, simple diffusion in osmosis, right, that was the movement of molecules and water respectively from an area of high concentration to low concentration. That's down or with that concentration gradient. Whereas active transport, they can move a molecule against the concentration gradient. Again, using ATP. Active transport uses ATP. Okay, got to remember that. Okay. Remember the integument, right? The integumentary system. Remember its functions, right? Protecting the body from environmental hazards, right? Synthesizing and storing lipids, coordinating immune responses to pathogens and cancers in the skin. We're able to sense information from our skin, synthesize vitamin D3, able to excrete waste, right? And we're also able to regulate our body temperature, thermoregulation, right? So remember those functions of the integumentary system. Remember that it's going to be made up of the epidermis, right? Well, let's think about the cutaneous membrane, or just the skin, right? The cutaneous membrane is going to be made up of the epidermis and the dermis. The epidermis is going to be that top, most superficial layer, right? 5 layers in thick skin, the hands, right? The palms of the hands, soles of the feet, and then thin skin everywhere else. Okay. Remember that epidermis is going to be made up of stratified squamous epithelium, right? Whereas the dermis is going to be made up of connective tissue, right? So remember that. And when we're looking at epithelia, right, we got to classify it based on its layering. So we can classify epithelia based on its layering, right, and its shape. So there's 2 types of layering, right? There's simple, right, when it's just only one layer of cells, okay? And then you have stratified, look at that. It's 2 or more layers of the cell, okay? So remember the 2 different type of layerings. Simple, 1 layer. Stratified, more layers, okay? Remember the other type of classification of epithelia based on their shape? We have squamous or squamous epithelia, right? They're relatively flat in appearance. You have cuboidal epithelium. They're going to be looking like a cube. You have columnar epithelium. They're going to be shaped like a column, right? So they're going to be longer than they are wide, right? So remember those, excuse me, remember those shapes of epithelial cells. Right? And remember glands too. I'll end it with glands. Remember glands. We have exocrine glands, right? Exocrine glands, okay? They secrete fluid or substances through a duct, right? Remember these exocrine glands secrete through a duct. Now those endocrine glands, they secrete, right, directly into the blood or the lymph, right? And typically these endocrine glands, they're going to be hormones, right? They're going to secrete hormones into the blood or the lymph, right? So that was just a quick little overview or quick little review, right, of some of the things that you'll see that we've talked about, right, during week 1. Do well in your quiz, guys.